On May 27, 1941, Germany's most powerful battleship sank beneath the North Atlantic. Over 2,100 men went down with her. Only 115 survived. Hundreds more were left treading water when British rescue ships fled, abandoning them to the freezing sea. For more than 80 years, two versions of this story have competed for truth. The British claimed their guns and torpedoes destroyed the pride of Hitler's navy. The Germans claimed their crew scuttled their own ship rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Both sides insisted they were right, but when advanced underwater drones descended nearly 16,000 feet to the wreck, they captured evidence that neither side expected. What the cameras recorded did not challenge one version of history, it challenged both. The Bismarck was a monster, 823 feet long, over 50,000 tons fully loaded, 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling 1,800-pound shells more than 20 miles, an armor belt up to 12.5 inches thick. German propaganda called her unsinkable. For a few terrifying days in May 1941, the British Admiralty feared they might be right. By spring of that year, Britain stood alone. The Atlantic convoys were the nation's lifeline. Food, fuel, weapons, raw materials. Everything crossed the ocean in slow, vulnerable merchant ships. German U-boats were already taking a devastating toll, but submarines had limitations. They were slow. They scattered when warships appeared. A surface raider like Bismarck was a different threat. Fast enough to run down any merchant ship, powerful enough to destroy any escort. A single battleship loose in the shipping lanes could scatter entire convoys, leaving dozens of merchant ships defenseless against the U-boat packs that followed. On May 18, 1941, Bismarck departed occupied Poland, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. This was Operation Rheinübung, the breakout into the Atlantic. If successful, the raiders would tear through convoy routes for months. Britain would bleed. The Germans thought they had slipped away undetected. They were wrong. Swedish observers spotted the ships. British intelligence picked up the report. By the time Bismarck entered the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Greenland and Iceland, the Rheinland, the Royal Navy knew exactly where she was headed. HMS Suffolk detected the German ships on the evening of May 23rd. HMS Norfolk joined the shadowing. Neither cruiser was strong enough to engage, but they did not need to fight. They just needed to hold contact and call in reinforcements. The British response was already underway. Racing to intercept was the most famous warship in the Royal Navy, HMS Hood, the Mighty Hood, the ship that had represented British naval supremacy for over 20 years. She would be at the Denmark Strait by morning. HMS Hood was everything Britain believed about itself. 860 feet of steel and firepower, 42,000 tons, 8 15-inch guns matching Bismarck's armament. For 2 decades, she had been the largest warship afloat, the symbol of an empire that still ruled the waves. But Hood carried a secret vulnerability. Her armor design dated to 1916, before architects understood how shells fired at long range would plunge down onto deck armor rather than strike the belt. Her horizontal protection was thin by modern standards. Upgrades had been planned, postponed, then postponed again. When war came, there was no time. Accompanying Hood was HMS Prince of Wales, one of Britain's newest battleships. On paper, formidable. In reality, she had been commissioned barely a month earlier. Her crew was still learning the systems. Civilian contractors remained aboard. Her gun turrets had a tendency to jam. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland commanded from Hood's bridge. His plan was aggressive: close the range quickly, bring maximum firepower to bear, destroy the Germans before they could escape. He knew Hood's weakness to plunging fire. The solution was to get close, where shells flew flat and struck the thick belt armor. The forces made contact in the early morning of May 24th. At 5:52 a.m., Holland ordered his ships to open fire. The range was too far, but Holland was closing fast. At approximately 6 a.m., Hood began turning to unmask her rear turrets. Bismarck's fifth salvo arrived as she turned. At least one 15-inch shell struck near the mainmast, penetrating to the ammunition magazines below. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. A column of flame erupted between the funnels. The entire aft section was consumed in a fireball that rose hundreds of feet. Hood's back broke. Her bow pitched upward, hung there for a moment, then slid beneath the surface. 3 minutes. The largest warship in the Royal Navy, gone in 3 minutes. Of 1,418 men aboard, 3 survived. They were pulled from the freezing water 2 hours later. No one else was found. It remains the single greatest loss of life in Royal Navy history. Prince of Wales fought on alone, but was outmatched and malfunctioning. Captain Leach ordered withdrawal. Before retreating, however, Prince of Wales scored 3 hits on Bismarck. 2 caused minor damage, 1 did not. A 14-inch shell struck below the waterline, rupturing fuel tanks and contaminating additional stores. Bismarck was trailing oil. Her range was limited. Admiral Lutyens made a fateful decision. The Atlantic raid was over. Bismarck would make for occupied France. When news of Hood's destruction reached London, the reaction was immediate. Winston Churchill issued a 3-word order that mobilized the largest naval pursuit in history: sink the Bismarck. Every available British warship converged on Bismarck's projected course. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers. The home fleet, Force H from Gibraltar. Ships were pulled from convoy escort duty, leaving merchants vulnerable to U-boats. Nothing mattered except revenge. But first, they had to find her. On May 25th, Bismarck slipped away. The shadowing cruisers lost contact. For agonizing hours, the British had no idea where the German battleship had gone. Was she doubling back to Norway? Continuing into the Atlantic? The Admiralty's plotting rooms filled with uncertainty and dread. Then Lutyens made a mistake. Believing he was still being tracked, he transmitted a lengthy radio message to German Naval Command. British direction finding stations triangulated the signal. Bismarck was heading southeast, toward France. The hunt resumed. But the British were running out of time. Bismarck was fast, and the French coast was getting closer. If she reached the protection of Luftwaffe air cover, the Royal Navy would lose her. Everything depended on slowing her down. On the evening of May 26th, 15 Swordfish torpedo bombers launched from HMS Ark Royal. They were relics, canvas-covered biplanes designed in the 1930s. So slow and fragile, they seemed to belong to a different war entirely. Their maximum speed was barely 140 miles per hour. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns could throw up walls of fire. The pilots knew many of them would not return. They attacked through heavy seas and failing light. Bismarck maneuvered violently, her gunners filling the sky with flak. Most torpedoes missed or failed to detonate, but one struck home. It hit the stern just below the waterline. The explosion jammed both rudders hard to port. Damage control parties worked desperately through the night, but the rudders would not move. Bismarck could now only steam in circles. She was doomed. Everyone aboard knew it. British destroyers closed during the night, harassing the crippled giant with the torpedo attacks and gunfire. Bismarck's crew, exhausted from days of battle and pursuit, could not rest. Shells whistled overhead in the darkness. The ship lurched and shuddered. Dawn would bring the main British fleet, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Morning came gray and cold. At 8:47 a.m. on May 27th, the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney opened fire. The heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire added their guns. Bismarck fought back, straddling Rodney with her opening salvos, but scored no direct hits. Her fire control systems were damaged. Her exhausted crews struggled at their stations. One by one, her turrets fell silent. By 10 a.m., Bismarck was a burning wreck. Superstructure shattered, guns wrecked, flames from bow to stern. But she would not sink. The British poured shells into her at point-blank range. Over 2,800 rounds were fired, more than 400 hits. The upper works were obliterated, yet the hull remained stubbornly afloat. Dorsetshire closed to finish the job with torpedoes. At 10:40 a.m., Bismarck rolled to port, capsized, and disappeared beneath the waves. Over 2,100 men went into the water. Some had jumped before the sinking. Others were thrown clear as the ship turned over. They floated in the cold Atlantic, clinging to debris, watching British ships approach. Rescue had come. Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori began pulling survivors from the sea. Lines were thrown. Scrambling nets were lowered. Men who had been enemies minutes before reached down to haul German sailors to safety. Then a lookout reported a periscope. Whether it was real or imagined, no one would ever know. But the order came immediately. All ships were to withdraw. The U-boat threat was too great. Rescue operations ceased. Dorsetshire and Maori pulled away, their decks crowded with the men they had already saved. Behind them, hundreds of German sailors remained in the water, watching their only hope of survival steam toward the horizon. They called out. They waved. Some tried to swim after the departing ships. It was hopeless. Only 110 men were rescued by British vessels. A German U-boat and a weather ship later found 5 more survivors. The rest, perhaps 800 men or more, died in the freezing Atlantic. They drowned. They froze. They slipped beneath the waves one by one, alone and abandoned. The British had their victory. The controversy over how to describe it began immediately. If you are still here, you have witnessed one of the most brutal naval engagements in history. Hood destroyed in 3 minutes. Bismarck pounded into a burning wreck. Hundreds of men abandoned in freezing water while rescue ships steamed away. And a controversy that would rage for the next 80 years. Comment the number 2 below if you are following this investigation, and if you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us tell the stories that official histories left incomplete. Now let us talk about how the technology finally caught up and what the cameras found nearly 3 miles down. The argument started before the survivors had dried off. German sailors insisted they had scuttled their own ship. Demolition charges in the engine rooms. Seacocks opened to flood the hull. Bismarck went down on German terms, not British. The Royal Navy dismissed this as face-saving propaganda. Their guns and torpedoes had destroyed the enemy. The physical evidence lay nearly 3 miles down, far beyond any investigation. For almost 50 years, the debate remained theoretical. The Atlantic depths were unreachable. Pressure at 15,700 feet exceeds 7,000 pounds per square inch. No diver could survive it. No submarine of the era could operate there. Bismarck kept her secrets in absolute darkness, and the arguments continued without resolution. Then the technology caught up. In 1989, Dr. Robert Ballard turned his attention to Bismarck. 4 years earlier, he had discovered the wreck of RMS Titanic using revolutionary deep-sea imaging systems. The same technology could reach the German battleship. After an initial failed attempt in 1988, Ballard's team located the wreck on June 8, 1989. What they found surprised everyone. Bismarck rested upright on the slope of an extinct underwater volcano, embedded in sediment to approximately her original waterline. The hull appeared remarkably intact. Unlike Titanic, which had broken apart and showed massive implosion damage, Bismarck looked almost preserved. Her superstructure was devastated by shellfire, but the main hull seemed whole. Ballard's cameras captured what they could, but 1989 technology had limits. The remotely operated vehicles were tethered cameras with restricted mobility. Lighting was inadequate for detailed forensic work. The team could observe the general condition, but could not examine specific damage patterns closely. They could not enter the wreck. In 2001, 2 separate expeditions visited the site with more advanced equipment. David Mearns led a British-funded team using the ROV Magellan 725, capable of systematic surveys and high-definition recording. They documented shell impacts, torpedo damage, and the overall wreck condition in unprecedented detail. Mearns concluded that torpedo damage played a significant role in the sinking. In 2002, James Cameron arrived with the Russian research vessel Academic Keldysh and her Mir submersibles. These manned vehicles could maneuver precisely around the wreck, and Cameron's custom-designed ROVs could penetrate interior spaces for the first time. What had been glimpsed could now be studied. What had been debated could now be tested against physical evidence. The cameras descended into the darkness. What they recorded would challenge 8 decades of competing narratives. The first thing the cameras revealed was what they did not find: implosion damage. When a ship sinks with air trapped inside, the crushing pressure of deep water collapses compartments violently. Steel buckles inward. Bulkheads crumple. The destruction is unmistakable. Titanic showed extensive implosion damage. Other deep wrecks showed similar patterns. Bismarck showed none. The hull sat intact, structurally sound, embedded in sediment as if it had been placed there gently, rather than plummeting 3 miles through black water. Ballard noted this immediately in 1989. Subsequent expeditions confirmed it. The compartments had not imploded because they were already flooded when the ship sank. Water inside equalized the pressure from water outside. The hull was spared. This was the first concrete evidence supporting the German scuttling account. If the crew had opened seacocks and flooded the ship before it went down, the lack of implosion damage was exactly what investigators would expect to find. The armor belt told another story. Bismarck's designers had protected her vital machinery and magazines with thick steel plating along the waterline. This citadel was meant to resist enemy shells and torpedoes. The expeditions examined it closely. Ballard found 8 torpedo holes in the hull. All of them were above the waterline armor belt. The protected section had not been penetrated. British torpedoes had struck the ship repeatedly, but they had not breached the armored citadel where flooding would prove fatal. The damage was real. The damage was serious. But the damage had not defeated Bismarck's defensive design. Shell impacts told a similar story. The superstructure was obliterated, gun turrets wrecked, bridge structure shattered, fire control systems destroyed. Everything above the main deck had been smashed by over 400 direct hits. The British had rendered Bismarck completely combat ineffective, but when investigators examined the hull itself, they found something unexpected. Only 4 shells had penetrated the belt armor. 4 out of more than 2,800 rounds fired. The armored protection had held against a bombardment of staggering intensity. The ship was beaten. The ship was burning. But the ship was not sinking from shellfire. Cameron's expedition provided the most detailed interior examination. His ROVs penetrated spaces no camera had reached before. They examined the torpedo bulkheads, the internal walls designed to contain flooding from torpedo hits. The bulkheads were largely intact. One torpedo hit was studied closely. It had punched through the external plating and flooded the compartment behind it. But the inner protective barrier had held. The flooding was contained. It had not spread to vital spaces. The evidence was building toward an uncomfortable conclusion for the British narrative. Torpedoes had hit, but not penetrated the citadel. Shells had devastated the upper works, but barely touched the armored hull. Bismarck was wrecked as a fighting ship, but the physical damage alone did not explain why she sank when she did. Then there were the seacocks. German survivors had testified that the order to scuttle included opening the sea valves to flood the engineering spaces. Ballard's examination found evidence consistent with this account. Cameron's investigation supported the finding. The valves that controlled water intake appeared to have been opened deliberately. The ship had been flooded from within. Complicating the forensic picture was the manner of Bismarck's descent. When the ship sank, it struck an underwater volcano and triggered a landslide that carried the hull nearly 2 kilometers down the slope. This violent journey inflicted additional damage. Torpedo holes may have been widened, plates may have been torn. Distinguishing between battle damage and impact damage required careful analysis. The stern separation presented its own mystery. The aft section of the ship had broken away completely and has never been located. The break occurred roughly where the Swordfish torpedo had struck, the hit that jammed the rudders and sealed Bismarck's fate. Some analysts believe the stern separated at the surface as the ship capsized, the weakened structure finally giving way. Others think it broke during the descent. Either way, the crippling blow that doomed Bismarck left structural damage that contributed to the breakup. When Cameron compiled his findings, the conclusion was direct. The Germans had scuttled their ship. The evidence was overwhelming. Torpedo damage was present but had not breached the armored citadel. Shell damage was catastrophic above the waterline but minimal below it. The lack of implosion damage indicated the hull was flooded before sinking. The seacock evidence pointed to deliberate action by the crew. Bismarck was not sunk by British firepower alone. She was finished by her own men carrying out orders to deny the enemy their prize. The Royal Navy had beaten her into helplessness. The Kriegsmarine had chosen how she would die. For 8 decades, British accounts emphasized a straightforward victory. The Royal Navy hunted down Germany's most powerful battleship and destroyed it. Guns and torpedoes sent Bismarck to the bottom. The official history was clean and satisfying. It avenged Hood. It demonstrated British naval supremacy even in the darkest days of the war. The forensic evidence suggests that this telling is incomplete at best. British firepower rendered Bismarck helpless. This is beyond dispute. The shattered superstructure, the wrecked gun turrets, the devastated bridge all testify to the ferocity of the final bombardment. By 10 a.m. on May 27th, Bismarck could not fight, could not maneuver, could not communicate. She was a floating ruin, crewed by exhausted men waiting to die. But beating an enemy and sinking their ship are different claims. The armored citadel held. The torpedo bulkheads contained the flooding. The hull remained intact below the waterline. When Admiral John Tovey ordered his ships to withdraw because they were running low on fuel, Bismarck was still afloat. It took scuttling charges and open seacocks to put her under. The German narrative fares better against the physical evidence, but it too requires qualification. Survivors always insisted they had denied the British their prize. The crew went down fighting, then chose their own end rather than surrender. There is truth in this. The scuttling was real. The defiance was real. But it was not a victory. By the time the demolition charges detonated, Bismarck was already dying. Flooding from battle damage was spreading. The ship listed heavily to port. Fires burned uncontrolled. Tovey himself admitted in his official dispatch that the ship would have sunk within hours regardless of German action. The crew chose the manner of death, not whether death would come. The physical evidence splits the difference uncomfortably. Both sides were partly right. Both sides were partly wrong. Neither narrative captures the full truth. and the full truth serves neither nation's preferred memory. In 1941, Britain desperately needed a clear victory. Hood's destruction had been a tragedy for morale, the pride of the Royal Navy blown apart in 3 minutes. Nearly 1,500 men killed, only 3 survivors. The nation was shaken. Churchill understood that the response had to be decisive and the story had to be simple. We sank the Bismarck. That was the message, not we beat it into a wreck, and then the Germans finished it themselves. The cleaner narrative served wartime purposes. Peacetime forensics tell a more complicated story. The implications extend beyond national pride to naval architecture itself. Bismarck's defensive design performed remarkably well under conditions it was never meant to survive. The belt armor held against everything the British threw at it. Hundreds of shells, multiple torpedoes. The citadel remained intact. What defeated Bismarck was not superior firepower against her protected spaces. It was a single torpedo from an obsolete biplane striking her unarmored stern. The rudders jammed. The ship could not maneuver. Everything that followed was consequence. The lesson was clear to those who studied it carefully. Even the mightiest battleships had vulnerabilities in places their designers never anticipated needing protection. The age of the battleship was already ending. Aircraft would dominate the seas. Bismarck proved it, though the proof would only become obvious in retrospect. The debates about who sank Bismarck can obscure a simpler truth. Over 2,100 men died on that ship. Their bodies remain inside the wreck, preserved by cold and pressure and darkness. They have been down there for more than 80 years. They will be down there forever. The German government claims ownership of the wreck under international law. It is considered a war grave, a seaman's burial ground entitled to the same respect as a cemetery on land. Diving expeditions to the interior require government permission. That permission is categorically denied. The dead are not to be disturbed, but every expedition disturbs them. Camera lights probe spaces where men spent their final moments. Remotely operated vehicles navigate corridors that became tombs. The forensic investigation that settled historical arguments also intruded on a mass grave. There is no way to learn what the cameras revealed without accepting that cost. The abandonment weighs heaviest. When Dorsetshire's lookout reported a periscope, rescue operations stopped immediately. The threat may have been real, it may have been imagined. A floating barrel, a trick of light on the waves, the exhausted eyes of men who had just fought a battle, seeing danger where none existed. No one will ever know. But the order was given, and the ships pulled away. Behind them, hundreds of German sailors watched their only hope of survival disappear over the horizon. They had surrendered. They had stopped fighting. They floated in water cold enough to kill within an hour, waving at ships that would not return. Some tried to swim after the departing vessels. The effort only hastened their deaths. Estimates suggest 800 men were left in the water. They drowned. They froze. They died of wounds that might have been treated. They slipped beneath the waves alone, abandoned by enemies who had beaten them and could not risk staying to save them. Only 115 men survived the sinking of Bismarck. 110 were rescued by British ships. 5 more were found by German vessels days later. The symmetry of the tragedy extends beyond one ship. HMS Hood took 1,415 men down with her. 3 survived out of nearly 1,500. Her wreck lies in the Denmark Strait, also designated a war grave, also protected from disturbance. The 2001 expedition that examined Bismarck also visited Hood. Both wrecks told their stories to the cameras. Both hold their dead in darkness. Hood's bell was recovered in 2015 and placed in the National Museum of the Royal Navy. It had originally belonged to an earlier ship of the same name, carried over as a connection to tradition. Now it rings in memorial ceremonies, one toll for each year of Hood's service. The sound marks absence. The men it honors will never come home. The forensic debates serve history. They correct the record. They replace propaganda with evidence. But the men who died in those ships were not symbols or arguments. They were young, most of them. They had families who never saw them again. They followed orders into a battle they did not choose, fought for causes they may or may not have believed in, and died in cold water far from anyone who loved them. The Atlantic holds them all equally, British and German, victor and vanquished, the ones who sank the enemy, and the ones who went down fighting. They are all down there now, together in the dark, beyond any rescue that matters. The evidence has answered the central question as clearly as it ever will. British fire rendered Bismarck combat ineffective. Flooding from multiple sources was spreading through the hull. German crew members initiated scuttling procedures on orders from their officers. Demolition charges detonated in the engine rooms. Seacocks were opened to accelerate the flooding. The combination of battle damage and deliberate action sent the ship down at 10:40 a.m. on May 27, 1941. The Germans scuttled their ship. The British made certain they had no other choice. But certainty has limits. The exact moment when flooding became irreversible will never be known. Whether Bismarck would have sunk without scuttling and how long that would have taken remains a matter of estimation rather than proof. The precise sequence of the crew's final minutes died with the men who lived it. What each sailor experienced as the ship rolled over and the water came in exists beyond any camera's reach. Technology continues to advance. Each expedition has revealed details that previous equipment could not capture. Ballard's 1989 cameras showed the general condition. The 2001 remotely operated vehicles documented specific damage patterns. Cameron's submersibles penetrated interior spaces. Future generations will bring capabilities that do not yet exist. The wreck deteriorates slowly at that depth, but it deteriorates. Whatever secrets remain will not wait forever. Bismarck rests on the slope of an undersea volcano nearly 3 miles down. She sits upright, embedded in sediment, her hull largely intact. The 4 main gun turrets are gone, fallen away when the ship capsized, scattered somewhere in the debris field below. The superstructure is destroyed, shattered by shells that struck with the force of earthquakes. But the armored belt endures. The citadel held. Inside, in compartments that have not seen light since 1941, are the remains of men who chose to go down with their ship rather than see it captured. They made their choice. The sea keeps them. The drone cameras captured what decades of argument could not resolve. Bismarck was not taken. She was denied. Whether that distinction honors the dead or simply continues old debates among the living is a question the cameras cannot answer. The evidence is silent on what the truth is worth, and to whom, and whether knowing changes anything for the men who will never surface. The Atlantic keeps its dead. But sometimes with patience and technology and the will to look closer, it surrenders fragments of what happened to them. If you made it to the end of this story, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment below and tell us what stayed with you most. Was it the forensic evidence that challenged both sides of history, the hundreds of men abandoned in the water, or the fact that after 80 years, the truth still lies somewhere between 2 competing narratives? Your thoughts matter to us, so do not hesitate to share them. See you in the next video.